In the middle of a packed courtroom, a racist cop attacked Marcus Reed, a decorated black Navy SEAL, while the judge sat silent. The room froze as injustice played out in plain sight. But no one knew what was coming next, because only minutes later, the doors would burst open and military police would storm the building. How does a courtroom collapse from arrogance to chaos? In mere moments, if this stirs something in you, hit like and share this story because what happens inside that courtroom will shock you. Let's begin. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open and in walked Marcus Reed. He was 37 years old, a decorated black Navy SEAL, a man who had faced storms at sea and fire in combat. Yet here, in a place meant to serve justice, he was paraded in like a criminal. His wrists bore the faint red marks from the cuffs that had only just been removed. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply walked with that steady calm, the kind of calm that unsettles those who want to see fear. Marcus sat down at the defense table, his back straight, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression gave nothing away. No protest, no anger, just silence. That silence carried weight, and for some it was maddening. Across the room, Officer Cole Henderson leaned back in his chair with the kind of arrogance that fills up space like smoke. He was a white cop in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with a smirk that made it clear he thought the outcome of this trial was already written. From the moment Marcus entered Cole's eyes, followed him like a predator stalking prey. He didn't see a Navy SEAL, a man who had risked his life for the country. They were blind to that. What Cole saw was a black man sitting in the defendant's chair, and that was enough to fuel his contempt. Judge Edwards, an older white man with thinning gray hair, presided from the bench. His reputation was one of stern authority. People said he ran a tight courtroom, that he didn't tolerate nonsense. But there was something subtle in the way he glanced between Marcus and Cole, something almost imperceptible. He let Cole's sneers go unchecked, as though the balance of power in the room was already tilted before a word had been spoken. At Marcus's side sat Tom Bell, his court-appointed attorney. Tom was white in his early 40s, dressed neatly in a Navy suit. His voice was calm, his tone professional. But there was no fire in him, no sharp edge to his presence. He spoke like a man doing his duty, not like someone ready to fight tooth and nail for the person beside him. Every time Cole shifted in his chair or cleared his throat with disdain, Tom's eyes flickered nervously toward the officer, as though already bracing for a storm he wasn't sure he could withstand. The gallery was quiet, filled with the murmurs of a few spectators and the clicking of a journalist's pen. People had gathered not just for the case, but for the spectacle. A black Navy SEAL accused of misconduct, that headline alone was enough to draw a crowd. And yet, as they watched Marcus sit in silence, many leaned forward, waiting for him to defend himself, to shout, to explain. But he gave them nothing. To them, his silence looked like weakness. To Cole, it looked like victory. Cole crossed his arms and leaned closer toward the prosecutor's table. His smirk widened, almost daring Marcus to look at him. Figures he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those around him to hear. Big Navy man, but can't even speak up for himself. Tom shifted uneasily, but didn't object. The judge didn't reprimand. And so, the insult hung in the air, stinging not because Marcus reacted, but because he didn't. Marcus's silence was heavy. It wasn't the silence of a man defeated. It was the silence of someone who knew exactly what was happening, but chose not to play their game. And that silence, though misunderstood, only deepened the unease that crept through the courtroom. Judge Edwards tapped his gavel once, bringing the opening murmurs to a close. His voice echoed in the chamber, "This court will come to order." The words carried authority, but even then, His eyes lingered longer on Marcus than on anyone else, not in curiosity, but in suspicion. The trial had begun, but already the air was thick with imbalance. It wasn't just Marcus on trial, it felt as if his very identity, his very right to stand equal in that courtroom, was being weighed and measured. Tom shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and began his opening remarks. His voice was even, his words rehearsed. He spoke of fairness, of presumption, of innocence. But his tone was thin, lacking conviction. The words seemed to float above the jury rather than strike them in the chest. Cole leaned back confident and whispered to the prosecutor beside him. A quick exchange, a laugh muffled behind a hand. They weren't worried. Not about Tom, not about Marcus. To them, this wasn't a battle, it was cleanup. And all the while, Marcus sat still. His eyes focused forward, his hands never moving from where they rested. It was a composure that should have commanded respect, but in this room, it was twisted, interpreted as passivity. The unspoken message was clear, a black man sitting quiet, while a white cop filled the space with smirks and whispers. This was how the system liked it. But what the courtroom didn't see, what they couldn't see yet, was that Marcus's silence was not surrender. It was a storm gathering, a storm that would not be ignored. The tension tightened near the end of that first hour. Cole, emboldened by the judge's leniency and Tom's restraint, shifted forward in his seat. He fixed his eyes on Marcus, and this time his voice rang loud enough for the entire gallery to hear. "You think your uniform makes you better than me? Not in here. In here, you're nothing." The words cracked through the courtroom, cutting into the silence. A few gasps broke out from the gallery. Even Tom froze his pen, stopping mid-note. Judge Edwards adjusted his glasses but said nothing. He allowed the insult to stand, as if it were just part of the proceedings. For the first time, Marcus turned his head slowly toward Cole. His gaze was calm, unflinching. He didn't say a word. But in that silence was a weight heavier than any outburst could have carried. The room grew still. Even those who thought Marcus weak a moment ago felt something shift. His silence was not weakness, it was warning. And though no one realized it yet, that warning was the first crack in the facade. A crack that would soon split this courtroom wide open. The courtroom had barely settled into its rhythm when Cole Henderson decided he couldn't keep his mouth shut any longer. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and let his words spill like poison into the air. "Typical," he said, loud enough for the jury to hear. "Another thug in uniform thinking he's somebody. Doesn't matter if you served in the Navy. You're still just another black criminal sitting where you belong." The words hit the room like a slap. A few people in the gallery gasped. Others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. And yet, a thin ripple of laughter came from the back corner. A small group who seemed to feed off Cole's arrogance. Marcus did not move. His face was still, his posture unchanged. He sat as if the insult had never been spoken, his eyes fixed on a point ahead, steady, unblinking. That composure, it wasn't indifference. It was deeper, sharper. The kind of stillness that carried more weight than words ever could. Cole noticed it, and it infuriated him. "Look at him," Cole sneered, turning toward the gallery. "Won't even defend himself, because he knows it's true." A woman in the front row lowered her gaze, her lips pressed tight as though holding back tears. A man beside her shook his head in quiet disapproval. But further back, two young men chuckled, nudging each other, entertained by the spectacle. The room was splitting, some seeing a cruel injustice, others cheering it on like sport. Marcus's silence wasn't weakness, but Cole couldn't stand it. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to drag Marcus down into the mud, to strip away that calm until there was nothing left but rage. "Answer me, boy," Cole spat. "Or are you too scared to speak?" Still, Marcus remained silent. Only his eyes shifted slightly, meeting Cole's gaze for the first time. And in that single look was something so steady, so unshaken, it cut deeper than any retort could have. Cole's jaw tightened. His smirk faltered for just a second before twisting back into something darker. He wasn't going to let it go. He pushed himself up from his chair, ignoring the murmur that swept across the room. The prosecutor tried to tug at his sleeve, whispering for him to sit down, but Cole brushed him off. He crossed the courtroom floor in 3 heavy steps, his boots echoing against the marble. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply turned his head, watching Cole approach like a soldier trained to hold his ground. And then, it happened. Cole's hand shot out and shoved Marcus hard on the shoulder. The force wasn't enough to topple him, but that wasn't the point. The point was humiliation. To lay hands on a man in open court, in front of a judge, jury, and public, it was an act meant to strip Marcus of dignity, to show him as small, powerless. The gallery gasped. Some rose to their feet, outrage written on their faces. Others laughed nervously, as if unsure whether to be shocked or entertained. Tom Bell, Marcus's attorney, half stood, his face pale. "Your Honor," he began, his voice trembling. But Judge Edwards hesitated. His gavel hovered in his hand, not striking, not silencing. For a long, tense moment, he just watched. The air in the room thickened with disbelief. A white officer had just shoved a black defendant in open court, and the judge was frozen. Cole smirked again, satisfied. "What's the matter, Reed?" he taunted. "Where's that Navy strength now?" Marcus still didn't rise. He didn't strike back. He didn't even speak. He simply straightened in his chair, his body like stone, his gaze unbroken. But if anyone looked closely, they would have seen his hands. Resting on the table, his fingers curled tighter, the veins in his forearms standing out, the controlled power of a man holding back more than anyone in that room could imagine. It was subtle, but it was there, the smallest crack in his stillness. Not rage unleashed, but rage restrained. And that restraint was terrifying. The gallery felt it. The laughter died down. The whispers stopped. One by one, the onlookers realized they weren't watching a man defeated. They were watching a man who could end everything in a heartbeat, but chose not to. Cole didn't see it. Or maybe he did, and that's why his smirk grew sharper, bolder. He thought he had won, that he had proven his point. But what he didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that Marcus's silence, his restraint, was the very thing that would turn this trial into something far greater than anyone expected. The shove was supposed to break Marcus. Instead, it broke the illusion that this courtroom was fair. And though Judge Edwards finally tapped his gavel weakly, calling for order, the damage was already done. The line had been crossed. The storm had begun to gather. The shove should have triggered an explosion. That's what everyone expected. A Navy SEAL, even in shackles, wouldn't let a racist cop push him around without consequence. But Marcus Reed didn't move. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he lifted his eyes and locked them on Cole Henderson. It was not the look of a beaten man. It wasn't anger flaring wild and reckless. It was colder than that, sharper than that, an icy, unbroken stare that cut through Cole's smug grin and hung in the air like a warning no one could quite name. The room felt it. A ripple moved through the gallery. A couple of jurors glanced uneasily at each other. Even the bailiff, standing by the door, straightened his posture, as though suddenly aware of something larger unfolding. And in the back row, 3 older black men veterans, by the look of their posture and the quiet authority etched into their faces, leaned toward one another. They didn't laugh, they didn't gasp. They simply nodded, murmuring low enough for only each other to hear. They knew that kind of silence. They had worn it themselves in uniform in jungles and deserts, in moments when holding still was more powerful than firing back. One of them whispered, "That man's waiting. He's holding something back." Outside, word had already begun to spread. A handful of people who had left the courthouse earlier now returned, drawn by whispers filtering through the corridors. Reporters smelled a story, their cameras ready, their phones raised. "A Navy SEAL humiliated inside a courtroom," someone muttered, and that phrase traveled fast down the steps across the street, into the crowd gathering outside the heavy wooden doors. The building itself seemed to pulse with expectation. Inside, Cole mistook that silence for victory. He smirked and leaned closer, his voice dripping with venom. "See, all muscle, no backbone. Navy can teach you to fight, but it can't change what you are. You'll always be beneath men like me." The insult landed heavy, the words intentionally sharp. Some in the gallery flinched as if struck themselves. A woman near the front shook her head, muttering under her breath, "This isn't justice. This is a circus." Still, Marcus did not react. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, his jaw set like stone. The silence deepened, growing unbearable, like the pause before a storm breaks. Judge Edwards finally lifted his gavel, tapping it once. "Order. Maintain order in this court." His voice carried authority, but there was something hollow in it. He didn't reprimand Cole. He didn't address the shove or the insults. He just brushed at the chaos like dust on a sleeve, unwilling to see the fire spreading before him. Cole turned slightly, offering the judge a nod of feigned obedience. Then he faced Marcus again, his smirk returning. "What's the matter?" "Reed Cat got your tongue." Marcus shifted at last. Not much, just leaning slightly toward his attorney Tom Bell, who sat stiff and pale beside him. Tom was still shaken, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of his notes. Marcus's lips barely moved, his voice low, almost a whisper, but clear enough for Tom to hear. "Just a few more minutes." Tom froze. His eyes darted to Marcus's face, searching for an explanation for any sign of panic or desperation. But what he saw unsettled him even more. Calm. Controlled. Like a man sitting on knowledge no one else in the room possessed. Tom swallowed hard. He leaned back slowly, unsure if he should press for answers or stay silent. In the end, he chose silence, trusting that Marcus, his client, his burden, knew something he did not. The whisper changed the air. Marcus wasn't broken. He wasn't scared. He was waiting. The veterans in the back exchanged glances again, sharper this time. One of them exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, though without humor. "He knows something," he murmured. "Watch him. That man ain't done yet." The gallery grew restless. Some leaned forward, captivated, as if sensing that this wasn't the end, but the beginning. The hum of reporters outside bled faintly into the room, muffled by the thick wooden doors. The courthouse had become a stage, and every heartbeat stretched the tension tighter. Cole still didn't see it, or refused to. He mistook patience for defeat. He stepped back just enough to spread his arms wide, addressing the gallery like a performer taking center stage. "This is the Navy's finest. This is what we're supposed to respect. A man who can't even defend himself in a courtroom." Some chuckled. Some winced. But no one looked away. And Marcus Reed, calm, silent, unyielding, kept his eyes fixed on Cole Henderson. That stare was not empty. It was a signal. Not to the room. Not even to Tom Bell. It was a signal to something outside those walls. Something drawing closer with every tick of the clock. No one in that courtroom knew it yet. But the moment Marcus whispered those words, just a few more minutes, the story had already changed course. He wasn't trapped. He was waiting. And waiting was the most dangerous move of all. The courtroom was locked in that tense silence only found in places heavy with judgment. Then, without warning, the double doors swung wide. The sharp rhythm of boots struck the marble floor, echoing like a drumbeat. A unit of armed military police filed in their uniforms, pressed their movements crisp, every step radiating command. At their front marched Lieutenant Colonel Hernandez, his presence cutting through the room with an authority no gavel could match. The air shifted instantly. Moments earlier, Cole Henderson had been the loudest voice in the chamber. Now his face drained of color. The smirk he wore so easily faltered as he turned to see who had entered. Reporters scrambled for their cameras, flashes bursting like lightning. Spectators leaned forward, some gasping aloud. The sound of pens scratching shutters, clicking, and hurried whispers filled the air. Judge Edwards, who had sat tall and composed all morning, stiffened in his chair. For the first time, it seemed the bench itself had lost its gravity. His gavel hovered, but no strike came. Hernandez's voice broke the tension low, yet commanding enough to silence every rustle in the room. "Marcus Reed," he declared, each word deliberate, "we are here under direct orders from the Department of Defense." The effect was immediate. A ripple of shock passed through the gallery. It wasn't just that soldiers had entered a civilian court, it was the weight behind those words. This wasn't a polite request. It was the kind of summons that rewrote the room's balance in an instant. Cole swallowed hard, his bravado slipping with every second. He had pushed, mocked, even shoved Marcus minutes ago, believing him just another black defendant cornered by the system. But now, the very ground beneath him seemed to shift. Marcus didn't flinch. He only lifted his chin slightly, offering Hernandez a small, steady nod. The calm in his expression was almost disarming, as if he had expected this moment all along. The MPs fanned out with precise formation, two of them stepping behind Marcus, not to restrain him, but to stand guard, protectors, not captors. Their silent presence said everything the court had refused to acknowledge. Marcus Reed wasn't a man abandoned. He was a man shielded. Outside, the crowd surged. The sound of chanting rose faintly through the courthouse windows as word spread a Navy SEAL humiliated in open court was now under the protection of the military. The story had left the walls of the courtroom, carried on every journalist's lips, every lens, every phone raised high. Inside, Judge Edwards shifted again, his discomfort plain. He cleared his throat, but whatever words he had planned seemed to die on the air. Authority no longer belonged to the bench. It stood in combat boots, rifles slung discipline, radiating from every motion. Cole's jaw tightened, his hands twitching at his sides. He glanced at Edwards as if begging for the judge to reclaim control, but the old gavel looked powerless now. All Cole could do was stand frozen, staring at the soldiers who had turned the entire trial upside down. And through it all, Marcus remained quiet. His silence was no longer weakness, it was weight. Every person in that room felt it. His calm was louder than Cole's insults, sharper than the judge's gavel, stronger than any law twisted against him. Lieutenant Colonel Hernandez gave a curt nod, then took a single step closer to Marcus. "You are under our protection," he said firmly. "You will not stand here alone." The words didn't just belong to Marcus. They belonged to every veteran watching, every bystander who had seen enough of injustice, every reporter ready to spread the truth. The court had started the morning suffocating in imbalance, one black man surrounded by hostility, prejudice, and doubt. But now, in the space of a heartbeat, the weight of power had shifted, and you could feel it in the air. Nothing would go back to the way it was. For a long moment, the room was still, every eye on the soldiers now standing guard behind Marcus. Then, from the benches near the side, another figure rose. It was Captain Alejandro Ramirez, a man in uniform himself, broad-shouldered and steady. He had been summoned that morning for an entirely different case. But as his eyes fell on Marcus, something stirred in his expression, recognition sharp and undeniable. He cleared his throat, his voice firm but carrying an edge of emotion. "Your Honor," he began, not waiting for permission. "I know this man," a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ramirez squared his shoulders, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "I served with him," he said louder now, "in the deserts of the Middle East, when my unit was pinned down, when every one of us thought it was the end. This man Marcus Reed pulled us out. He saved my entire unit. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here today." The words struck the room like a thunderclap. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of truth. All those insults, the slurs, the shove, it all collapsed under the force of Ramirez's testimony. You could see it in the faces around the chamber. People who had laughed before now sat frozen, their smirks gone. Those who had sighed in pity straightened in their seats, realizing the man in handcuffs wasn't just another target of prejudice, he was a hero. Cole Henderson, caught completely off guard, blurted out, "Lies! He's making this up! You can't believe him!" His voice cracked as he pointed a trembling finger toward Ramirez. "He's just covering for one of his own." But the military police stepped forward instantly, their voices cutting through his protest. "Order in the court!" The gavel finally came down, though Judge Edwards's strike sounded weaker than before. The authority no longer felt like his to command. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the energy swelled. Reporters shouted into microphones, their words tumbling out in feverish excitement. Breaking news. A decorated Navy SEAL humiliated by police in open court, only to be revealed as a war hero by a fellow officer. Cameras flashed relentlessly. Phones streamed live. The story was no longer hidden inside four walls. It was spreading like fire. And yet, at the center of it all, Marcus remained still. He didn't rise to his feet, didn't pound his chest, didn't demand recognition. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, almost as if Ramirez's praise embarrassed him. His hands, those same hands that had clenched in restraint moments earlier, rested calmly on the table. That humility said more than any speech could. It wasn't just the silence of a man refusing to stoop to hate, it was the grace of someone who carried the weight of sacrifice and never once asked the world to repay it. The crowd felt it. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply stared, struck by the quiet dignity that filled the space where shouting once reigned. Even Cole seemed smaller now, his outbursts echoing like a child's tantrum in a cathedral. No amount of shouting could erase what Ramirez had revealed. No insult could shrink the truth of Marcus's service. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't divided by laughter or pity anymore. It was united by awe, awed that the man treated as less than human had in fact been the one who had risked everything for others. And though Marcus said nothing, his silence wasn't emptiness. It was power. It was restraint. It was the sound of a man letting the truth speak louder than he ever needed to. The air was still vibrating from Captain Ramirez's testimony when Lieutenant Colonel Hernandez stepped forward once more. His boots echoed on the marble floor, steady and deliberate. In his hands he carried a thick sealed folder stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the Department of Defense. He stopped at the bench, gave a crisp salute, and placed the folder before Judge Edwards. "Your Honor." Hernandez said, his voice firm and unshaken, "This file has been cleared for disclosure under federal authority. Its contents concern Officer Cole Henderson." The judge hesitated, his hand hovering above the folder like it was burning hot. For the first time that morning, Edwards's polished composure wavered. Slowly he opened it. The crackle of paper seemed deafening in the silence. What spilled out wasn't just routine paperwork, it was history, ugly, undeniable, and heavy with consequence. Page after page revealed a damning record, prior investigations into Cole Henderson. Incidents buried under layers of bureaucracy. Complaints filed by black citizens who had been beaten, threatened, or humiliated. Each case followed the same pattern: charges, raised evidence stacked high, only for it all to quietly disappear. Dismissed, buried, forgotten. Because Henderson had friends in powerful places. The room grew restless. Whispers spread like sparks leaping from dry wood. People leaned forward, straining to catch the details as the judge's eyes widened with every page he turned. And then came the most explosive revelation: new evidence recently unsealed showing Henderson had gone far beyond mere abuse of power. He had orchestrated false charges against Marcus Reed. He had deliberately manipulated reports, twisted testimony, even leaned on subordinates to fabricate incidents, painting Marcus as a criminal, when in truth, the man was clean. This wasn't just misconduct. It was a calculated campaign of destruction. The audience erupted. Gasps, shouts, angry voices filled the chamber. A group of veterans pounded the benches in outrage. Outside, word traveled faster than the gavel could fall. Protesters who had gathered out of curiosity now hoisted signs high in the air. From the courthouse steps came a unified chant: "Justice for Reed! Justice for Reed!" Cole's face drained of color. He stammered, shaking his head. This is a setup you can't prove." But the words collapsed under the weight of the file sitting wide open before the bench. Judge Edwards pounded the gavel, but it was no use. Order wasn't his to command anymore. His voice was drowned in the swell of fury from both inside and outside the courtroom. For the first time, Edwards looked like a man cornered, unsure whether he was still in control. And through it all, Marcus remained still. He didn't rise. He didn't lash out. His eyes stayed fixed on Cole, calm, steady, almost sorrowful. Not a trace of triumph. Not the faintest smirk. Just that quiet, dignified gaze that seemed to cut deeper than rage ever could. His restraint said it all. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. The contrast was striking Cole, unraveling in panic, while Marcus sat in composed silence, the embodiment of strength under fire. The people saw it. They felt it. And in that moment, they began to understand this wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was a mirror held up to an entire system. Judge Edwards, sweating now, closed the file with a trembling hand. He looked from Hernandez to Marcus, then back to Cole, as if searching for a way out of a storm too big to contain. Finally, with his voice unsteady, but clear enough for the record, he declared, "This court cannot proceed under current jurisdiction. In light of the evidence presented, this case will be referred to federal authorities. Proceedings are hereby suspended until reviewed under federal law." The words landed heavy. The very ground of the trial shifted. What began as a local courtroom spectacle had just escalated into something far larger. A federal investigation, one that would strip away the protection Cole had always counted on. The reaction was immediate. Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder, filling the air like thunder rolling across the city. Inside, the energy was electric, reporters scribbling furiously, veterans nodding in grim satisfaction, citizens raising their phones to capture every second. And still, Marcus said nothing. His silence spoke louder than Cole's desperate denials, louder than the crowd's chants, louder than the gavel that could no longer silence anyone. It was the silence of a man who had nothing left to prove. The silence of truth, standing unshaken. Cole's face had gone from pale to crimson, his jaw trembling as though the ground itself had betrayed him. He slammed his fist against the defense table, his voice cracking as it tore through the courtroom. Lies. Every last word of it is a lie. The sudden outburst jolted the room. Reporters jerked their cameras upward, pens racing across their notepads. The gallery leaned forward, caught between disbelief and morbid fascination. But the chaos didn't last long. Tom Bell, calm as stone, didn't even flinch. He simply closed his folder, stood slowly, and said in a voice that carried more weight than Cole's roar ever could. "No, Officer Cole. This isn't a lie. This is justice." The words cut sharper than any blade. Cole staggered back as though struck. His breath came in uneven bursts, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for some lifeline that no longer existed. For years he had hidden behind his badge, his influence, his father's legacy. But in this moment, stripped bare before the world, he looked less like a man of authority and more like a cornered child. And then, in a silence that felt too heavy to hold, the truth spilled out. His voice wavered, but he forced the words past his clenched teeth. "My father. He was a cop. He taught me since I was a boy. Taught me that people who looked like Reed were dangerous. He said they were the enemy. And I believed him." The courtroom froze. Not even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to exist. Cole's confession didn't roar like his rage had moments earlier. It fell like a whisper into a canyon, echoing in the hearts of everyone listening. For the first time, Marcus lifted his gaze and truly looked at Cole. His expression held no triumph, no vindication. Only a quiet sorrow, the kind that comes from recognizing the waste of a human life, consumed by hatred. His eyes seemed to say what his lips never did. "You could have been so much more." That look, steady, calm, almost merciful, struck harder than any gavel. Cole flinched, his body sagging, as though the last of his strength had abandoned him. The fury that once defined him dissolved into something smaller, weaker. Shame. His shoulders slumped, his voice broke, and for a fleeting moment, he wasn't a villain, nor an officer, nor a man of power. He was simply someone who had been taught to fear and hate, and had never found his way out. Around the courtroom, the change was palpable. A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes. A reporter lowered his pen, staring blankly at the man unraveling before him. Even the bailiff, a hardened veteran of countless trials, shifted uneasily as if seeing Cole in a new and tragic light. For a heartbeat, the anger that had gripped the room since morning softened into something else understanding. Cole wasn't just an aggressor. He was a product of a broken system raised on poison and convinced it was truth. The realization hurt because it rang too close to home. Yet justice is not swayed by sympathy. And Hernandez knew it. He gave a curt nod to his men. The military police moved in their boots, striking the floor, in a rhythm that left no doubt Cole's time of power was over. Cole didn't resist. The fire was gone. He bowed his head as the cuffs closed around his wrists, the sound of metal echoing louder than his earlier shouts. A lifetime of arrogance ended in that single hollow click. Tom Bell gathered his papers without another glance, his silence a verdict more final than any statement. Judge Edwards, usually so firm in her authority, struggled to find words. She shifted in her seat, her gavel hovering mid-air, but finally lowered it without striking. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus, then back to Cole, as though realizing this trial was no longer hers to command. It belonged to the truth that had forced its way into the open. Cole lifted his head one last time as the MPs guided him toward the exit. His eyes swept the gallery, searching for something. Anger, pity, recognition. What he found instead were faces wet with tears, not for him as a man, but for what he represented. Another life swallowed whole by prejudice. A tragedy that had spread too far, too long. And in that moment, Cole seemed to understand. His lips parted, but no words came. Just silence. A silence that admitted defeat, that carried both guilt and despair. Marcus sat still, his hands resting calmly on the table. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply watched, unblinking, as the man who had sought to destroy him was led away. To Marcus, justice wasn't about revenge, it was about balance, about truth finally outweighing lies. As the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind Cole, the room exhaled as one. People wiped their eyes. Others shook their heads. A reporter whispered, "Even the villain was a victim," and the words seemed to hang in the air. But beneath the sorrow lingered an unshakable truth. No matter how Cole had been shaped, his choices were his own. The cost of those choices had come due, and justice had been served. And so, in that quiet aftermath, the trial didn't feel like a victory or a defeat. It felt like a reckoning. When the federal court doors opened, it was like stepping into an entirely different atmosphere. The room carried the same polished wood and solemn silence of any courtroom. But this time, there was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. The man presiding was not the same weary local judge from earlier. This was Judge Alan Whitmore, a federal judge with a reputation for being both stern and unshakably fair. His gaze cut across the room with the kind of presence that made everyone sit straighter. Nobody doubted for a second who was in charge now. The gallery filled quickly. Reporters crammed the back rows, their cameras flashing just before they were ordered off. Veterans in uniform sat shoulder to shoulder with civilians, their chests heavy with ribbons and medals that told their own stories of sacrifice. You could feel it. The case had shifted from a local spectacle into something that spoke to the whole nation. The prosecution began with Assistant U.S. Attorney Carla Martinez. She was concise but forceful, her words crisp as she laid out the evidence like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. She went over the timeline of the attack, the testimony of witnesses, and the damning video that captured Cole's outburst in the courtroom weeks before. What you will see, she told the jury, is not only an assault on one man, but an assault on justice itself. Her voice didn't waver. She carried the room. But what held everyone's attention wasn't just Martinez, it was Marcus. For the first time since this nightmare had started, he took the stand and spoke. When he rose from his chair, the shuffle of his dress shoes against the floor seemed louder than it should have been. He stood tall, shoulders square, the kind of posture you'd expect from a Navy SEAL, even one who had carried scars both visible and unseen. He looked at the jury and then at Judge Whitmore and began. His voice was calm, steady, like a current moving beneath the surface of still water. "Cole called me names that I won't repeat here," he said, his tone even stripped of malice. He mocked my skin, my service, and everything I stood for. But I didn't answer him with hate. I couldn't. I've spent my life fighting to protect the country we all share. I wasn't going to dishonor that by stooping to his level. Every word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, drawing the room tighter. He wasn't dramatic, and that made his testimony even more powerful. He simply told the truth. People leaned in closer, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Then came Sergeant Luis Ramirez. A seasoned veteran himself, he wore his dress blues with quiet pride. When he took the stand, he didn't bother with long speeches. He looked Marcus square in the eye before turning to the jury. "This man," he said, pointing at Marcus, "saved my unit when we were cornered. He put himself in harm's way without hesitation. Some of us came home because of him. I'm one of them." That's the truth. There was no performance, no embellishment, just one soldier affirming another. You could almost feel the ripple through the courtroom, the respect, the weight of shared history, the unshakable bond of men who had stood on the edge together. Outside the courthouse, the story had already become a storm. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Headlines blared across the country. Decorated black Navy SEAL faces. Racist attack in court. Federal trial opens. Every evening news station carried the story. Editorials poured in. And perhaps most powerful of all, the community of veterans, men and women of every color, spoke up. They rallied. They wrote letters. They held vigils, standing outside, with flags folded against their chests. For many Americans watching at home, this wasn't just another trial. It was a mirror being held up to the nation. Was the system truly capable of delivering justice when racism had already left its fingerprints on every corner of the case? Inside Judge Whitmore made sure the proceedings never veered into chaos. When defense counsel tried to downplay Cole's words as just heat of the moment, Whitmore's gavel came down hard. "This court will not excuse hate as passion," he declared. And the silence that followed was louder than any shout could have been. Marcus sat back at the defense table, quiet again after his testimony. But now, his silence didn't feel like retreat. It felt like strength, the kind of silence that forces everyone else to reckon with their own noise. As the day closed, Martinez gathered her files and looked across the courtroom. She knew the case had shifted. The jury had seen not just the brutality of Cole's actions, but the dignity of the man who had endured them. The trial wasn't over, but the tide had turned. When court adjourned, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Some wept openly, others clapped their hands over their mouths as if afraid to break the spell of what they'd just witnessed. Outside, chants rose, veterans, activists, everyday citizens raising their voices together. The case of Marcus Wright was no longer confined to a courtroom. It had become a national story, one that questioned what kind of justice America was ready to stand for. And that night, as headlines stretched coast to coast, one thing was certain: the country was watching. The federal courtroom was hushed when the guards brought Cole back in. His wrists were shackled, his steps clumsy, but he still tried to hold his chin high, as if pride alone could shield him from what was coming. The jury had already reached its decision, and everyone in that room knew we were about to witness the end of something. Judge Whitmore sat higher than usual on the bench, his gavel resting near his hand. You could sense the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. This wasn't just about Cole anymore. It was about whether the system itself could answer hate with justice. The room felt so tight you could hear the sound of someone clearing their throat 2 rows back. Families of veterans, activists, reporters with notepads poised, every face turned toward the defendant. Cole shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward the jury box. And then it happened. In a last burst of desperation, he leapt to his feet and shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "He's nothing but a black man in a uniform." The words cracked across the chamber like lightning, jagged and ugly. For a moment, time seemed to stop. No one breathed. Even the bailiff froze in mid-step. It was the kind of silence that comes when the ground beneath you suddenly splits open. All eyes turned to Marcus. He rose slowly, not rushing, not rattled. There was no anger on his face, just that calm strength he had carried through the entire trial. He took a single step forward, the chains of Cole's words still hanging in the air, and then he spoke. "No," Marcus said, his voice firm but steady. "I am a soldier, an American soldier. And today, justice wins." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed heavy like iron on stone, echoing in the rafters, and down into every chest in that room. You could see it in the faces around me, people blinking back tears, people nodding quietly as if Marcus had spoken what they themselves couldn't find the words to say. Cole's shoulders sagged. The fire drained out of his eyes, replaced by something hollow, something lost. The arrogance that had carried him all this way was gone in an instant. He sank back into his chair, his face, pale lips trembling. For the first time, he looked small. Judge Whitmore didn't wait long. His voice rang clear as he delivered the verdict. "Officer Richard Cole, this court finds you guilty on all counts. You are hereby stripped of your badge, your title, and your authority. You will serve a long-term sentence in federal prison, with no possibility of early release. Justice has spoken." The gavel fell sharp as thunder. A ripple spread through the courtroom, gasps, quiet sobs, the rustle of uniforms as veterans stood in silent salute. Some people clasped hands, others bowed their heads. Nobody cheered, not yet. It wasn't that kind of victory. It was quieter, deeper, a collective exhale that said at last. Cole sat crumpled, his once defiant stare now empty. He looked less like a man and more like the shell of one. The very words he had used to degrade Marcus had become his own undoing. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply returned to his seat, that steady posture, never breaking. He had said what needed to be said, and nothing more. His silence now carried more weight than Cole's screams ever had. Outside, the news spread within minutes. Crowds waiting beyond the courthouse steps erupted not in wild celebration, but in chants of unity, voices rising together, calling for change, for accountability, for dignity. Veterans held their flags higher, their faces streaked with emotion. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, knowing history had just unfolded before their cameras. But inside that chamber, what I'll never forget is the stillness. The way Marcus's words seemed to hang in the air long after the verdict was read. The way Cole sat slumped, broken by the very justice he had tried to evade. And the way the judge's gavel echoed like a closing door, final, unarguable, absolute. It wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the sound of a line being drawn clear and sharp between what this country should stand for and what it could no longer allow. Marcus stood when the court adjourned. He placed his hand briefly on Ramirez's shoulder, a silent gesture of thanks. Then he turned toward the gallery, toward the veterans who had stood by him, toward the strangers who had lent their voices. He gave them a small nod, humble and resolute. And in that quiet nod, I think everyone in the room understood this wasn't only Marcus's victory. It was a victory for every soldier who had been disrespected, for every black man and woman who had been diminished, for every American who still believed justice was worth fighting for. The trial was over. The story, though, was only beginning. The courtroom fell silent. The white cop's rage had burned out, leaving him trembling in handcuffs, while the black man stood tall and calm, his quiet strength echoing louder than any shout. The judge, once blind to the truth, now faced the weight of justice. In the weeks that followed, the officer was sentenced, his badge stripped away. But more powerful than his downfall was the rise of a deeper truth: dignity cannot be destroyed by hatred. The black man, no longer just a victim in their eyes, became a symbol. His story spread across news outlets and living rooms, sparking conversations about race justice and the strength of restraint. When asked why he never struck back, he simply said, "Because justice isn't won with rage, it's carried with patience and truth." And with those words, his legacy reached beyond the courtroom into the hearts of a nation ready to remember that real power is not in force but in integrity. And that brings us to the end of today's story. Marcus's journey reminds us that true courage isn't about fighting for personal pride. It's about standing tall for justice, for dignity, and for the kind of world we want to leave behind. His story is not just his own. It's a mirror for all of us, asking whether we're willing to push back against injustice and hold fast to what's right. If this story moved you, I invite you to support our work here on Mr. Mac's Stories. Please take a moment to hit the like button, share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss the next story we bring to life. Your support means the world to us. Every like, every share, every subscription is what gives our team the strength to keep creating stories that matter. Stories that shine a light on truth, justice, and hope. And remember, here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe that every story carries a heartbeat, and every heartbeat deserves to be heard.